It began with a river, not a mighty one like the Nile or the Euphrates, but one whose waters flowed gently through the central Italian hills, carving out valleys and nourishing the land. The Tiber River, winding and often unpredictable, carried more than silt and fish. It carried destiny. On its banks would rise a city unlike any before it, a city that would stretch its hand across continents, command legions, and etch its name into the very bones of history. But long before the marble temples and iron legions, before the roar of the Colosseum and the thunder of chariots, there were two brothers, twins, swaddled in myth and blood, Romulus and Remus, born of war, raised by beasts, destined to build a world. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, was a Vestal virgin, sworn to chastity and silence. But fate, ever the trickster, had other plans. Mars, the god of war himself, came to her under shadow and mist, and from their union came the twins. This was no ordinary birth. The gods had intervened. The throne of Alba Longa, the old Latin city from which their line descended, had been seized by a usurper, King Amulius, a cruel man who feared prophecy and bloodlines more than armies. When he heard of the twins, he ordered them drowned in the Tiber. But the river, swollen with spring rains, defied him. The basket carrying the infant snagged in the reeds at the base of the Palatine Hill, one of 7 ancient rises that would someday cradle Rome. There, in the tangled underbrush, a she-wolf, Lupa, found them. Or perhaps she was no wolf at all, but a symbol of something older, something primal. Either way, she suckled them beneath a fig tree, watched over by a woodpecker sacred to Mars. Myth and nature became one in that moment. The brothers survived. Later, they were found by a shepherd named Faustulus, who raised them as his own. They grew strong, restless, bold, chieftains among other boys, thieves of livestock, scourges of bandits. But blood calls to blood. When they learned of their true heritage, they stormed Alba Longa, overthrew Amulius, and restored their grandfather, Numitor, to his rightful throne. Still, peace could not hold men like these. They sought something greater. They returned to the banks of the Tiber, where their cradle once drifted, and resolved to build a new city. But even among brothers, ambition can be poison. A dispute arose. Who would lead? Where would they build? Remus favored the Aventine Hill, Romulus the Palatine. They turned to the gods for a sign. Remus saw 6 vultures. Romulus saw 12. The omen spoke, but the interpretation fractured their bond. Romulus began marking the city's boundaries on the Palatine. Remus, defiant, mocked the effort, leaping over the low ridges of his brother's wall. It was a symbolic act, maybe just a jest, but it was enough. Romulus, furious, struck him down. Whether with sword or spade, myth does not say. Only that Remus fell. And Romulus became the sole founder of Rome. He named it Roma after himself. A king, born of war and fratricide, now stood alone upon a hill of wolves and omens. The date, by Roman reckoning, would later be fixed as April 21st, 753 BCE. Ab urbe condita, from the founding of the city. It would become a sacred anniversary, celebrated with festivals and sacrifices for centuries. But the early Rome of Romulus was no city of gold. It was a cluster of huts, woven from straw and mud, scattered along the Palatine slopes. No grand senate, no triumphal arches, just smoke curling from simple hearths, guarded by walls barely high enough to keep out wolves, let alone men. Romulus needed more than stone. He needed people. His solution was bold. He declared Rome an asylum, open to fugitives, outlaws, exiles. And they came. Thieves, slaves, wanderers. Men with nothing to lose. They gave the city its rough, hungry edge. But they brought a problem. There were no women. Romulus turned his eye to the neighboring Sabines, a tribe with whom he had tenuous peace. He invited them to a festival, offering games and hospitality. When the Sabines arrived with their wives and daughters, Romulus gave a signal. Roman men snatched the women and drove off the Sabine men in chaos. This became the infamous rape of the Sabine women, not a tale of violence in the modern sense, but of abduction for forced marriage. Brutal by today's standards, but in Roman eyes, it was destiny asserting itself. The Sabines, enraged, declared war. Battles were fought on the very hills that would one day host marble temples. At the height of the conflict, the abducted women, now wives and mothers, intervened. They stood between their new Roman husbands and their Sabine fathers and brothers, pleading for peace. Blood paused for breath. The two peoples merged, and the kingship was shared. Romulus with the Sabine leader, Titus Tatius. It was a union of necessity, not trust, but it solidified Rome as more than a village. It became an idea, a city of many origins. Romulus ruled for years after. Some say he disappeared in a storm, taken by the gods. Others say the senators, tired of his ambition, tore him apart in the forum and hid the pieces. But myth gilded the truth. He was deified as Quirinus, a god of the Roman people, protector of the state. His legacy was not in laws or marble, but in the belief that Rome was no accident. And what of the evidence? Beneath the layers of legend, archaeology whispers its truths. Excavations on the Palatine Hill have uncovered hut foundations dating back to the 8th century BCE, arranged in circular clusters just as Roman tradition described. Burial grounds in the Forum Valley show organized settlement patterns, proof that by Romulus's time, something was stirring on the Tiber's banks. Whether one man founded it or many clans converged, the legend echoes real beginnings. Rome was not born in silence or peace. It was forged in conflict, its foundation myth soaked in blood and divine ambition. That myth became its compass. Romans would forever see themselves as children of destiny, cradled by wolves, guided by gods, justified by conquest. From these first stones, stories, and sins rose an empire that would last over 1,000 years. But in the beginning, there were only two brothers, a hill, a river, and a single fatal choice. And from that moment, the world would never be the same. It was the twilight of kings. For over 2 centuries, Rome had lived under monarchs, 7 in all, according to legend, each laying brick upon brick of a city, still finding its shape. But by the time the last king sat upon the throne, the crown had grown heavy with arrogance, and the people with it. That king was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquinius the Proud, and he would be the last to ever rule Rome as a monarch. He did not earn his title lightly. Tarquin's reign began in blood and betrayal. His predecessor Servius Tullius was a reformer, a builder, a king who tried to bind the city's growing social classes with census and civil order. But he made one mistake. He trusted his daughter. Her name was Tullia, and she, like Tarquin, burned with ambition. Together, they plotted Servius's murder. Tarquin stormed the Senate house and threw the old king down its steps. Tullia, in her chariot, ran over her father's lifeless body in the street. The gods took notice that day. So did the people. But fear kept them quiet. Tarquinius ruled not as a guardian of his people, but as a tyrant. He abolished the traditional role of the Senate, which once advised the kings. Instead, he consulted only his inner circle, trusted no one but his family, and ruled by decree. He expanded Rome's influence through war, yes, but with brutality, not honor. He built the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer that still drains Rome to this day, and began construction of the grand temple of Jupiter Opt Imus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, a symbol of Rome's rising might. But these stones were laid with forced labor, peasants and conquered enemies pressed into servitude. Still power held. The people grumbled, but they endured. Until one night, everything changed. Tarquin had a son, Sextus Tarquinius, handsome, cunning, dangerous. One evening, while the Roman army was camped outside the Etruscan city of Ardea, a group of noblemen, including Tarquin's son and a relative named Lucius Junius Brutus, passed the time boasting of their wives. One, a man named Collatinus, spoke of his wife Lucretia. her virtue, her modesty, her loyalty. The others scoffed, so they mounted their horses and rode back to Rome in the dead of night to see for themselves. And there she was, Lucretia, weaving wool by lamplight, surrounded by servants, chaste and dignified. The others returned to camp amused or impressed. But Sextus Tarquinius returned again, days later, with darker intentions. He came to her home in Galatia, where he was received as a guest. That night, he crept into her chamber. With threats of shame and death, he forced her. What followed was not just a crime, it was a spark thrown into dry timber. Lucretia did not scream. She did not beg. She dressed herself in black and summoned her husband and father. Brutus came too. In tears, she told them what happened, not as a victim seeking pity, but as a Roman demanding justice. And then, before them all, she drew a dagger and plunged it into her heart. It was more than a death, it was a signal. The shame was hers, but the outrage belonged to Rome. Brutus, until then considered slow-witted, a deliberate mask to protect himself from the king's paranoia, threw off his disguise. He seized the dagger from Lucretia's lifeless hand, raised it to the heavens, and swore an oath. Never again would a king rule in Rome, and all around him, the others echoed it. Back in the city, the streets swelled with fury. Word spread like fire through dry grass. Lucretia, the virtuous Roman matron, defiled and dead. The people's patience shattered. Brutus and Collatinus led the revolt, rallying not soldiers but citizens, farmers, artisans, elders, people weary of tyranny and humiliated by injustice. Tarquin was still at Ardea, unaware that his throne was being burned behind his back. When he tried to return, the gates of Rome were shut in his face. He pleaded. He threatened. He demanded the loyalty of those who once called him king. But none would open the gates. The army too turned. Rome, for the first time in her history, banished her king. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus fled with his sons and a few loyal men. They wandered to Cagliari, an Etruscan city, then sought help from neighboring monarchs to reclaim the throne. But Rome had changed. The die was cast. There would be no return. And so, in the year 509 BCE, the Roman monarchy ended and the Roman Republic was born. Brutus and Collatinus were chosen as the first consuls, a new form of leadership, not kings but magistrates, elected, temporary, accountable. Their power was shared and their term limited to 1 year. It was not perfect, but it was Roman, and it was revolutionary. From the bones of monarchy rose the Senate, not a council of nobility anymore, but a legislative body that would guide Rome's destiny. Assemblies were created, comitia centuriata, comitia tributa, where citizens could vote on laws, elect magistrates, even declare war. The idea of res publica, the public thing, took root. And it was Brutus who paid the highest price. Tarquin, exiled but not defeated, sent envoys to Rome under the guise of diplomacy, but secretly to stir revolt. Letters were found, plans uncovered. Among the conspirators were Brutus's own sons, his blood. And still, the father presided over their trial. He did not waver. He watched them executed, stoic, unmoved. Rome came before all. This was the price of freedom. Even then, Tarquin would not give up. He sought aid from Lars Porsena, king of the powerful Etruscan city Clusium, who marched on Rome with his army. The city trembled, but Rome had found its spirit. One boy, Gaius Mucius, snuck into the enemy camp with a dagger. He killed the wrong man, Porsena's scribe instead of the king, and was captured. But when dragged before Porsena, Mucius thrust his right hand into a nearby fire and held it there without flinching. The Etruscans watched in horror as his flesh charred and blackened. He said, 300 others wait to do what I have done. Porsena, shaken by such resolve, chose peace. Rome was spared. Another tale tells of Horatius Cocles, a soldier who held the Sublician Bridge against the enemy while Roman engineers destroyed it behind him. Alone, shield raised, He fought wave after wave until the bridge collapsed. Then, he dove into the Tiber and swam to safety. The stories were part history, part legend, but the message was clear. Rome had found heroes not in kings, but in citizens. The new republic would not be a utopia. The patricians, Rome's elite, still held most of the power, and the plebeians, the common people, would spend generations fighting for equality. But the monarchy was dead, and in its place, a fragile but fierce idea took root. It would weather civil wars, corruption, foreign invasion. It would be tested by demagogues and dictators. But at its heart, the Republic stood for libertas, freedom. Not freedom as we know it today, but a Roman kind. The freedom to speak, to vote, to fight for your place in the world, to swear an oath on the blood of the fallen and mean it. The story of Rome's rebellion against kings was not merely a change in government. It was a shift in soul. The Romans would never again suffer a single man to hold total power without fear. They built systems of checks and balances, not because they were idealists, but because they remembered. They remembered Tarquin, they remembered Lucretia, and they remembered the terrible silence before Brutus raised the dagger. From that moment on, the Romans became obsessed with avoiding tyranny. No king would return, so they said over and over in law, in stone, in fire. Even when emperors eventually rose centuries later, they never dared take the title of king. That name was poisoned forever. And it all began with a woman's death and a brother's rage. With a gate that would not open. With an oath sworn in blood. And with the rise of a republic that would, in time, conquer the world, not by the will of kings, but by the will of its people. It happened on a summer day, the kind of day when the air was thick with dust and silence, and the Tiber shimmered like molten silver. The Romans by then had grown bold. Their republic was young but ambitious, its arms stretching into Etruria and Latium. They believed themselves rising gods among men, untouchable, eternal. But they had not yet learned fear. That lesson came from the north. From beyond the winding hills and dark forests of the Apennines. From lands where Latin was not spoken and Roman laws meant nothing. It came from a people the Romans barely understood, wild and fair-haired, speaking in guttural tongues and clad in bright colors and iron. They were called the Gauls, and their leader was Brennus. He was no king in the Roman sense. The Gauls did not kneel. But Brennus was the kind of man others followed without question, tall, fierce, eyes like embers in a storm. His warriors came not as diplomats or merchants, but as a tide of blades and fire. They had crossed the Alps years earlier, settling in northern Italy, in the region the Romans would one day call Cisalpine Gaul. But they were not content with land alone. They wanted silver, plunder, glory. And in the year 390 BCE, they turned their gaze toward Rome. The trouble began in the city of Clusium, an old Etruscan stronghold. Clusium, afraid of the Gauls, begged Rome for help. The Romans sent 3 envoys, not soldiers, but ambassadors. But they came not in peace. They took up arms and joined in battle against the Gauls, violating the sacred laws of diplomacy. It was an insult not just to Brennus, but to the gods. He demanded their surrender. Rome refused. So Brennus marched. The Roman Senate, confident in its legions, dispatched an army to meet the invaders. The place they chose was a shallow river north of the city, the Alaia. It was July 18th, a day that would haunt Roman calendars for centuries to come. The Romans had never fought an enemy like this before. The Gauls did not move in rigid formations or follow predictable tactics. They charged with terrifying speed, howling like wolves, beating their shields, their hair wild and their swords flashing in the sun. The Romans, disorganized, spread too thin, lacking cavalry support, broke almost immediately. The rout was absolute. Men died with their backs to the enemy, drowning in the river, cut down as they ran. The rest fled not to the city, but to the hills or to Veii, abandoning Rome itself to its fate. The Gauls arrived at the gates of Rome to find them wide open. The walls were undefended. The city was silent. What they found inside was not resistance but absence. Most of the citizens had already fled. Only a small group of senators and priests had remained, dressed in their sacred robes, seated calmly in the forum. They chose to meet death with dignity rather than disgrace. When the Gauls entered, puzzled by the stillness, one of them reached out to touch the long beard of a patrician named Papirius. Papirius, unmoving, struck the Gaul in the face with his staff. The warrior answered with a blade. The slaughter began. The Gauls set fire to homes, temples, granaries, everything. Flames danced across rooftops and smoke painted the sky black. Statues melted, archives crumbled, and generations of Roman history turned to ash. The screams echoed off stone and fire until even those fell silent. But all was not lost. A small force of defenders had taken refuge on the Capitoline Hill, the highest and most fortified of the city's 7. With steep cliffs and hastily reinforced walls, they held the high ground while the Gauls occupied the ruins below. Night after night, Brennus sent men up the slopes to try to take it. And night after night, the defenders beat them back. Then came the night of the silent approach. The Gauls moved under darkness, barefooted, shields on their backs, climbing the jagged rock like cats. They made no sound. No alarm was raised. The guards slept. Victory seemed within reach, until the sacred geese of Juno's temple screamed. They were no ordinary birds. These were omens, kept and revered by the priests. Their cries pierced the silence. A Roman named Marcus Manlius woke, rushed from his bed, and flung himself at the first invader to crest the wall, hurling him from the ledge. Others followed, blades drawn. The Gauls fell one by one, tumbling into the blackness below. The hill was saved by the cries of birds. But Rome below still burned. The siege dragged on. Supplies dwindled. Disease crept in with the summer heat. The Gauls, too, grew weary. They had no interest in ruling a city reduced to cinders. They wanted silver, wealth, so they offered peace. Brennus demanded 1,000 pounds of gold in ransom. The Romans, desperate to end the humiliation, agreed. They gathered what little remained: family heirlooms, temple offerings, melted coins. At the weighing, the Gauls cheated, placing heavy scales and laughing as they pressed them down with swords. When the Roman envoys protested, Brennus tossed his own blade onto the scales and declared, "Ve victis," woe to the vanquished. It was a moment Rome would never forget. But the end of the story, as Romans tell it, is not one of surrender. They say that even as the ransom was paid, a Roman general named Cam Illus, exiled but recalled in the city's darkest hour, returned with a new army. He denounced the deal, declared that Rome should be ransomed not with gold, but with iron, with the sword. And in a final clash, Cam Illus drove the Gauls from the city, reclaimed the ashes of Rome, and became known forever as the second founder. Historians debate the truth. Did Cam Illus really arrive in time, or was the gold paid and the Gauls departed, their bellies full and coffers heavy? The bones of the past cannot answer. But the Romans believed the story, believed that honor was restored at the last breath. And sometimes belief is more powerful than fact. What is certain is that the sack of Rome shattered illusions. The city, once thought safe behind hills and tradition, had been left naked. Its military was exposed as clumsy and outdated. Its defenses, non-existent. The trauma left scars not on bodies alone, but on the Roman psyche. In the years that followed, Rome began to transform. First came the Servian Wall, named for the long-dead king Servius Tullius, though it was built decades after him. Made of volcanic stone, towering over 30 feet in places, it wrapped around the city like a shield. Gates were reinforced, roads redirected. Rome would never again be caught unguarded. Then came the military reforms. The Manipular Legion was born, a more flexible formation than the rigid Greek-style phalanx Rome had used before. Soldiers were now grouped in units called maniples, arranged like a checkerboard to allow for better movement and adaptation on the battlefield. Light infantry, heavy infantry, cavalry, all were rethought, retrained, redeployed. Rome would not just defend itself next time, it would hunt its enemies. The Alia and the Capitoline siege became holy days of remembrance and warning. Rome marked July 18th, the date of the battle, as cursed. No public business was conducted on that day for generations. The very mention of the Gauls brought shivers. Children were told stories of wild-eyed warriors and geese that saved the city. It became more than history, it became myth. And in a strange way, that fire, that shame became Rome's forge. From the ashes of humiliation rose a city more disciplined, more determined, more dangerous. Rome learned to build not just for beauty, but for war. It learned that its enemies would not always play by rules, that not every threat came from within the Latin world. And it learned that survival sometimes came not from pride, but from perseverance. The sack of 390 BCE was the first and only time in the Republic's long existence that Rome was completely captured. But it would not be the last time foreign armies approached her walls. Centuries later, it would be Hannibal, then Sulla, then the Gauls again, then the Goths. But none would strike as deeply as that first wound, because in the firelight of that blackened summer, Rome lost her innocence. And in losing it, she became something new. Not just a city of stone and senators, but an empire in waiting. They called it the Punic Curse, the long, smoldering hatred between two rising powers, bound not by borders but by the endless blue of the Mediterranean. On one side stood Rome, hungry and untested, a land-hungry republic still forming its imperial bones. On the other was Carthage, ancient and proud, a maritime giant ruled by gold, trade, and ships that danced across the waves like leaves in the wind. Theirs would be a rivalry so bitter, so violent, that it would reshape the ancient world and end with one of them turned to ash. It began, as these things often do, with a dispute over a speck of land. The island of Sicily lay between Rome and Carthage like a jewel no one could share. A city called Messana, caught between two wolves, cried out for help. The Romans answered. The Carthaginians took offense. What followed was not a skirmish, but a war that would stretch for over a century through 3 brutal conflicts, countless battles, and rivers of blood spilled on both land and sea. The First Punic War, beginning in 264 BCE, was Rome's first real taste of war beyond the peninsula. Carthage, a Phoenician city founded centuries earlier, was a master of naval warfare, its ships sleek and fast, its harbors teeming with commerce and war. Rome, by contrast, was a land power, mighty legions, yes, but no navy. They had never fought on water before, so Rome built a navy from scratch. Legend says they captured a wrecked Carthaginian ship and copied it plank for plank. But Rome's strength was never invention, it was adaptation. They added a twist, the corvus, a boarding plank with an iron spike that could latch onto enemy ships and turn sea battles into infantry combat where Roman discipline could shine. The seas off Sicily turned red with battle after battle. Victory did not come swiftly. The war dragged on for 23 years, with both sides losing men, money, and morale. But in 241 BCE, Rome finally struck a decisive blow off the Aegates Islands. The Carthaginian fleet was shattered. The city, weary and bankrupt, sued for peace. Rome gained control of Sicily, its first province, and the war ended. But Carthage had not been broken, only bloodied. And its thirst for vengeance had only begun to boil. In the years that followed, Carthage turned its gaze to Iberia, modern-day Spain. There, a young general rose to power, clever, charismatic, and bred for war. His name was Hannibal Barca. He was the son of Hamilcar, the great Carthaginian commander of the First War. And from the time he was a boy, Hannibal was taught that Rome was the enemy. Legend holds that his father made him swear an oath before the gods, never to be a friend of Rome. It was a vow he would keep. Hannibal did not wait for Rome to strike. He lit the fire himself. In 218 BCE, he attacked Saguntum, a Roman ally in Iberia, breaking the uneasy peace. War was declared again, and so began the Second Punic War, the most famous, the most terrifying of all Rome's conflicts. To fight Rome on Italian soil was madness. Rome controlled the sea. The expected attack would come from the south. But Hannibal was no ordinary commander. He had studied the terrain, the politics, the psychology of war. And he chose a path no one expected through the Alps. It was winter. The mountains were cloaked in snow and ice. His army, tens of thousands strong, included war elephants, beasts Rome had never faced in the field. The journey was brutal: blizzards, landslides, ambushes by mountain tribes. Many died. But those who survived emerged like ghosts into northern Italy, ragged, frostbitten, and ready to make history. What followed was a nightmare Rome could not wake from. Hannibal moved like a phantom across the countryside, beating Roman armies again and again. In 218, he crushed them at the Trebia River, luring them into icy waters before encircling them. In 217, he ambushed another army at Lake Trasimene, slaughtering thousands in the fog. Panic gripped Rome. Mothers wept in the streets. The Senate called for a dictator. Enter Fabius Maximus, who tried a new strategy: avoid Hannibal, harass his supply lines, burn crops, deny him battle. It was sound policy, but Romans hated it. They wanted glory, not delay. They called Fabius the Delayer, half in scorn. So in 216 BCE, Rome raised the largest army in its history, over 80,000 men, and marched to face Hannibal at Cannae. It would be one of the greatest tactical disasters Rome would ever suffer. Hannibal, outnumbered, arranged his troops in a crescent with his weakest men at the center. As the Romans pressed forward, the center collapsed, drawing them in. Then the wings of Hannibal's army closed around them. It was a trap, a massacre. At least 50,000 Romans died, some say more. Senators, consuls, patricians, the flower of Roman nobility, were cut down. So many rings were taken from Roman corpses that the Carthaginians sent bushels of them back home as trophies. But Hannibal did not march on Rome. He lacked siege equipment. His army, far from home, was stretched thin. He waited, hoping Rome's allies would defect. Some did: Capua, Tarentum, even Syracuse. But many did not. Rome's stubborn loyalty, born of fear and pride, held, and Rome endured. Slowly, methodically, it turned the tide. It avoided large battles. It bled Hannibal out. It struck at Carthaginian supply lines in Spain and Sicily. Then, under a young and brilliant general named Scipio, Rome brought the war to Africa. Scipio, who had watched his father die in Spain and grown up in the shadow of Cannae, knew he could not win by caution alone. He forged alliances with Numidian horsemen and brought war to Carthage's doorstep. Hannibal was recalled from Italy. At Zama, in 202 BCE, the two great generals met. It was Hannibal's first and only defeat. His elephants were turned back, his cavalry outflanked. His veterans, though battle-hardened, could not stop Scipio's discipline. Carthage surrendered. Hannibal fled into exile. Rome imposed harsh terms. Carthage lost its fleet, its colonies, and its pride. Scipio returned in triumph, hailed as Scipio Africanus, the man who had avenged Cannae. But Rome was not finished. For decades, Carthage limped on, forbidden to wage war, crushed by tribute. But some in Rome, especially the hawkish Cato the Elder, believed Carthage would always remain a threat. Cato ended every speech in the Senate, no matter the topic, with the same words: Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BCE, Rome found its excuse. Carthage had defended itself against the Numidian incursion, technically a violation of the peace treaty. Rome declared war once more. The Third Punic War was not a contest, it was an extermination. The Roman army laid siege to Carthage for 3 years. The city resisted with desperate fury, but it could not hold. In 146 BCE, the walls were breached. The fighting spilled into the streets. House by house, room by room, Carthaginians fought and died. The end was apocalyptic. 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The city was burned to the ground. Salt was sown into the earth, they say, though that may be myth. What is certain is that Carthage ceased to exist. Rome stood alone. With Carthage gone, Rome now controlled the western Mediterranean. Sicily, Sardinia, Iberia, Africa, all Roman provinces. The Republic had become an empire in all but name. Its legions had marched farther than ever before. Its coffers overflowed with loot. Its pride, once wounded at Trebia and Cannae, now soared like an eagle. But victory came with a cost. The Punic Wars changed Rome, not just in borders, but in soul. The massive influx of wealth deepened class divides. The legions, once citizen farmers, returned to find their land sold or ruined, their farms swallowed by the estates of the elite. A new class of latifundia, vast plantations worked by slaves, rose. So did unrest. Generals like Scipio began to eclipse the Senate in prestige. Soldiers swore loyalty not to the Republic, but to their commanders. The cracks were forming. The wars had made Rome powerful, but they had also planted the seeds of civil war. Still, the people remembered the victories. The name Hannibal became a ghost story told to children. And Carthage, a once glorious city, now dust, stood as a warning to any who might oppose Rome. For the Republic had survived its greatest test. But in doing so, it had changed forever. The year was 133 BCE, and the Roman Republic stood tall, or so it seemed. Its banners flew over the Mediterranean world. Its generals carved paths of conquest through Iberia, Greece, and Asia Minor. Gold flooded in. New provinces bloomed. To the outside world, Rome looked like a god risen from the 7 hills. But beneath the marble temples and triumphal processions, the heart of the Republic had begun to rot. The cracks didn't come from foreign wars. They came from within. From the fields of Italy, where once proud citizen farmers were vanishing like morning mist. From the Senate chambers, where power had grown fat and corrupt. And from the streets of Rome, where thousands of landless citizens milled without work or hope. Into this world stepped a man who would change everything, not with a sword, but with a law. His name was Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. He came from noble blood. His father had been a respected consul and censor. His mother, Cornelia, was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the hero of the Second Punic War. His lineage was impeccable, his education elite, and yet his heart burned not for tradition, but for reform. He had seen what Rome was becoming. During his military service in Spain, he passed through the countryside and found vast stretches of land lying fallow. Once they had belonged to small Roman farmers, men who had marched off to war, never to return. In their absence, the wealthy elite had moved in, swallowing land illegally, fencing off public territory, and building massive latifundia worked by slaves. The result was a hollowing out of Rome's citizen body. The Republic had always been built on a delicate balance. In exchange for military service and civic duty, citizens had a stake in the land. But now that land was slipping away. The small farmer, the backbone of the legions, was vanishing. And with him, the Republic itself. Tiberius saw the danger, and he knew something had to change. In 133 BCE, he was elected tribune of the plebs, one of the 10 annual magistrates charged with protecting the rights of the common people. It was a powerful role, armed with veto authority and sacrosanct status. But no tribune in living memory had dared to use that power like Tiberius would. He proposed a sweeping land reform, the Lex Sempronia Agraria. The law aimed to enforce an old but long ignored rule that no citizen could occupy more than 500 jugera of public land, about 300 acres. plus an allowance for children. Any surplus would be reclaimed by the state and redistributed in small plots to the poor, particularly discharged soldiers. It wasn't robbery, it was restoration. But the elite saw it differently. To the Senate, the land was theirs by right, no matter the law. They had worked it, invested in it, profited from it, and now this young firebrand, one of their own, was threatening their wealth and power. The optimates, the aristocratic faction, were livid. Tiberius, undeterred, brought the bill before the popular assembly. He bypassed the Senate entirely, appealing directly to the people. That was a dangerous precedent. The Senate's power was based more on tradition than law. Ignoring it was not illegal, but it was radical. And then the first shot was fired. One of the other tribunes, Marcus Octavius, a staunch conservative, used his veto to block the vote. That should have been the end of it. The Roman system depended on mutual respect for office, and the veto was sacrosanct. But Tiberius didn't back down. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He called for the removal of Octavius from office. That had never been done before. Tribunes were supposed to be untouchable, immune even to each other. But Tiberius argued that Octavius no longer served the people. The assembly agreed and deposed him. The land bill passed soon after. Rome had crossed a line. Though the law moved forward and a new commission was set up to implement the redistribution, the Senate fought back. They cut off funding. They stalled appointments. They whispered in ears, stirred up mobs, and branded Tiberius a tyrant in the making. Tiberius responded by reaching further. He proposed using the treasure of the recently deceased King Attalus III of Pergamum, who had left his kingdom and its massive wealth to Rome in his will. Tiberius wanted that money to fund the land reform directly. Now he was threatening senatorial control of foreign policy and state finance. It was too much. And yet, Tiberius pressed on. His allies urged him to run for tribune again, a move allowed by law but rarely attempted. To his enemies, it looked like a grasp for permanent power, a challenge to the republic itself. Murmurs of kingship spread like smoke through the forum. Then came the fateful day. In the summer of 133 BCE, as Tiberius stood on the Capitoline Hill, addressing the assembly during the elections, a group of senators led by Scipio Nasica stormed the crowd. They carried no swords. Roman senators were not allowed to bear arms in the city, but they wielded clubs, sticks, and broken furniture. Anything they could grab. Tiberius saw them coming. He allegedly raised his hand to signal distress. His followers took it as a cry for a crown. The mob surged. Tiberius was struck on the head with a leg of a bench, perhaps even by Nasica himself, and trampled to death. Over 300 of his supporters were killed alongside him. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber River, unburied, disgraced. The tribune of the plebs had been murdered by the Senate, not in battle, not in exile, but in the very heart of the Republic, in the shadow of its temples, at the altar of its gods. For the first time in Roman history, political violence had shattered the sacred protections of elected office. It would not be the last. In the aftermath, the Senate tried to paint the act as defense of the Republic. Tiberius, they said, had been aiming at kingship, but the people didn't forget what they'd seen. A man standing for the poor had been beaten to death by aristocrats in broad daylight. The land reforms continued in a diminished form. Tiberius's brother, Gaius Gracchus, would later take up the cause and meet a similar fate. But the real change had already occurred. Something had broken in Rome. For centuries, the Republic had been held together not just by laws, but by mos maiorum, the customs of the ancestors. Senators did not kill tribunes. Tribunes respected vetoes. Disagreements were handled in debate, not bloodshed. Tiberius's death snapped that ancient web of mutual restraint. In its place rose factionalism, optimates versus populares, aristocrats versus reformers. Violence became a political tool. Ambitious men began to see that if the system could not be bent, it could be broken. They armed their followers, they formed gangs, the streets ran red. And beneath it all, the Republic continued to pretend it was unchanged, that the Senate still ruled with dignity, that the law still held. But the truth was laid bare in the mud and blood on the Capitoline stones. Tiberius Gracchus had not been a tyrant, nor had he been a savior. He was something far more dangerous, a warning. A sign that the Republic, for all its glory, was built on fragile ground. His murder was the beginning of a slow, inexorable slide. Decades later, that same violence would engulf men like Marius, Sulla, Caesar, and Octavian. Civil war would come, and the Republic would fall, not all at once, but piece by piece, starting here, with a tribune who believed the poor deserved land, and a Senate that answered with clubs. You stand at the edge of the known world, staring out across a vast and glittering sea. The sails catch the wind like the wings of white birds, and the water churns with the slow, deliberate approach of war. It is 31 BCE, and you are about to witness the last great gasp of the Roman Republic, the moment its long, violent death gives way to something new, something imperial. This is Actium, and it is not merely a naval battle. It is the final reckoning between two visions of Rome. On one side, Octavian, young and cold-eyed, heir to Julius Caesar and master of propaganda. On the other, Mark Antony, Caesar's old friend and loyal general, now bound not just by politics, but by passion to Cleopatra Vieth, Queen of Egypt. Before the ships clash, before the arrows darken the sky, understand this: the war was never just about armies or fleets. It was about power, and power in Rome, by now, no longer belonged to the Senate or the people. It belonged to those who could command loyalty, wealth, and myth. Let's step back for a moment. A generation earlier, Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon and shattered the Republic's illusions. His assassination in 44 BCE had not restored freedom. It had unleashed chaos. In the vacuum left behind, three men rose to claim Rome: Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son; Mark Antony, his brilliant second in command; and Marcus Lepidus, the forgettable third wheel. Together they formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal dictatorship. Their goal was vengeance. They hunted down Caesar's killers, Brutus, Cassius, and the rest, and crushed them at Philippi. But alliances forged in blood rarely last. Lepidus was quickly sidelined. That left only two, Octavian in the west, Antony in the east. They tried to keep the peace. But ambition has no borders. Antony took up residence in Alexandria, where Cleopatra waited with her silks, her treasures, and her dynastic dreams. The two became lovers, then partners. Together they ruled Egypt, Syria, parts of Anatolia. Cleopatra bore Antony 3 children. They crowned themselves rulers of the East. And in the eyes of many in Rome, Antony had gone native. Octavian saw the opportunity and struck. He launched a propaganda campaign, the likes of which Rome had never seen. Antony, he claimed, had abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's own sister, for a foreign queen. He had given away Roman lands to Cleopatra's children. He was bewitched, emasculated, seduced by Eastern decadence. It wasn't just personal, it was existential. Octavian framed the coming war not as Roman versus Roman, but as Rome versus Egypt, a clash of civilizations. He even managed to have the Senate declare war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. It was brilliant theater. In reality, of course, the enemy was Antony. But Octavian knew the people would not stomach another civil war. A foreign queen, however, made for a perfect villain. And so the fleets were built. Thousands of oarsmen, archers, and marines were gathered. The greatest naval battle in Roman history was about to begin. It happened off the coast of Greece, near a small promontory called Actium, at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf. Antony's forces had the advantage in size. His fleet numbered around 500 ships, many of them massive quinqueremes and hexeres, floating fortresses powered by rows of chained oarsmen. His army included tens of thousands of seasoned soldiers, and he held strong coastal fortifications. But Octavian had two advantages that mattered more: a brilliant admiral and the winds of fortune. His admiral was Marcus Agrippa, one of the most capable commanders of the age. A childhood friend of Octavian's, Agrippa had proven himself again and again, both on land and sea. In the months leading to Actium, he seized key naval bases along the western Greek coast, cutting off Antony's supply lines and forcing his fleet into the narrow gulf. It was a slow strangle. Inside the Gulf of Actium, Antony found himself trapped, his ships boxed in, his soldiers running low on provisions, his morale beginning to break. Cleopatra's fleet, anchored nearby, was sleek and fast, but her presence complicated matters. Many of Antony's Roman officers resented fighting for a foreign queen. And then came the day. September 2nd, 31 BCE. The sea was calm. The sun hung low. On the shorelines and the cliffs, soldiers and villagers stood watching as two navies prepared to decide the fate of the Republic. Octavian's fleet was smaller, about 400 ships, but more maneuverable, better organized, and commanded by veterans of many campaigns. Agrippa kept the formations tight, exploiting the narrow waters. Antony's fleet, by contrast, was massive but sluggish. Many of his ships had sat idle for months. The crews were underfed. Disease had weakened his ranks. And worst of all, Antony's leadership was clouded, not by incompetence, but by confusion. The plan was unclear. Some believed he intended to break through the blockade and flee to Egypt. Others thought he would commit to a full naval engagement. Cleopatra's fleet lingered at the rear, neither fully engaged nor fully withdrawn. Then the fighting began. It started with skirmishes, lines of ships advancing, ramming, boarding. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of oarsmen. Flaming arrows streaked across the sky. Grappling hooks pulled vessels together as Roman marines clashed with axes and swords on wet, burning decks. Antony's ships struggled to maneuver. Their size, once a strength, became a liability in the narrow waters. Agrippa's lighter vessels darted around them, striking and withdrawing like wolves around a bear. Slowly, methodically, they drove Antony's forces back toward the shore. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. Cleopatra turned and fled. With 60 of her Egyptian ships, she sailed out of the battle and toward open sea. Historians still debate her motives. Was it planned? A signal? A panic? Did she fear the tide had turned? Or was she always prepared to abandon Antony if the gods soured? Whatever the reason, Antony saw her sails and followed. He broke away from the fight, taking a few ships with him, and chased after her. That decision shattered what remained of his command. His fleet, leaderless, was torn apart. The rest of his ships were either captured, burned, or surrendered over the coming days. His army, abandoned on land, gradually defected to Octavian. The Battle of Actium was over. But it was more than a naval victory. It was the death knell of the Republic. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. There, in the faded grandeur of Alexandria, they waited. Octavian pursued them with cold patience. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. In 30 BCE, as Octavian's legions surrounded the city, Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra followed soon after, her death forever immortalized by tales of an asp and a golden couch. Their children were captured, their empire dissolved, and Octavian returned to Rome, not as a warlord, but as its undisputed master. But here is the most remarkable part. He refused to be called a king. Kings were anathema in Rome. Ever since the expulsion of the Tarquins centuries earlier, the Republic had defined itself against monarchy. Octavian understood that deeply, so he cloaked his power in the old traditions. He restored the Senate, at least in name. He accepted the title Princeps, the first citizen. Later, he would be granted the name Augustus, meaning the Revered One. He didn't destroy the Republic. he transformed it. All the organs remained: the Senate, the consuls, the courts. But real power flowed through one man. Augustus controlled the legions, the provinces, the treasury. He reigned not by fiat, but by consensus, manipulation, and myth. And Rome welcomed it. After nearly a century of civil wars, the people craved order. Augustus gave them that, along with roads, aqueducts, grain games, and glory. His reign marked the dawn of the Pax Romana, a 200-year stretch of relative peace and stability. The world had changed. But never forget, it changed at Actium. That stretch of water, stained with oil and blood, marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. The Republic, born in rebellion against kingship, died in a war that crowned an emperor. Not in name, but in truth. So when you stand on that lonely coast, staring out across the sea, remember what was lost and what was born. The dream of the Republic had faded, but from its ashes rose an empire that would dominate the world for centuries to come. Not with votes, but with legions. The Battle of Actium 31 BC. There was a time, not long after the death of Julius Caesar, when the future of Rome stood balanced on the edge of a blade, or more accurately, upon the crest of a wave. The Roman Republic, exhausted and battered by decades of civil war, was gasping its final breaths. Its fate would be sealed not in the Senate or on the floor of the Forum, but out on the Ionian Sea, where sails met salt and steel clashed above the churning deep. It was September of 31 BCE, and the waters off the coast of Actium, a narrow promontory in western Greece, would become the stage for one of history's most consequential battles, a clash not only of fleets, but of worlds. On one side stood Gaius Octavius, known simply as Octavian, the adopted son and heir of Julius Caesar. Ambitious, calculating, and young, he carried not only the hopes of his supporters, but the subtle, quiet intent of reshaping the entire Roman world. Opposing him was a man once thought unbeatable, Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony, veteran of Caesar's campaigns, gifted orator, and decorated general. But in the eyes of many, he had fallen, not just in stature, but in loyalty. For Antony no longer fought simply for Rome, he fought beside and for Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. And so, the final war of the Roman Republic would be waged not between citizen and citizen, but between Rome and something older, something foreign, something Eastern. To many back in the heart of the Republic, Cleopatra represented everything decadent, everything un-Roman. Sensuality, monarchy, wealth, power that flowed from bloodlines and divine pretenses. She called herself the reincarnation of the goddess Isis and ruled not only through politics, but allure. With Antony at her side, the two became a symbol not just of opposition to Octavian, but of betrayal to Roman tradition itself. Yet, this was no mere propaganda. Octavian, ever the strategist, had turned public opinion masterfully against Antony. He had secured the loyalty of the Senate by casting Antony as a man enthralled by a foreign queen, one who dared to divide Roman lands and raise legions with Egyptian gold. The will of Caesar, Antony's alliances, even his children by Cleopatra, all were twisted into weapons by Octavian's propaganda machine. But words alone wouldn't decide the matter. No, it would be determined at sea. By the summer of 31 BCE, Octavian had amassed a fleet of around 400 warships under the command of Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, one of Rome's most capable naval minds. Antony and Cleopatra, camped with their combined forces at the Gulf of Ambracia, had roughly 230 ships, many of them larger and more heavily armed, and an army stationed on land. On paper, their position wasn't weak. In fact, with Egyptian grain and treasure behind them, they should have had the edge. But cracks were forming. Morale was faltering. Desertions trickled, then flooded. Disease gnawed at their camp, supplies ran thin, and as the weeks dragged on, Octavian's fleet tightened its grip around the Gulf like a noose. Agrippa struck first, capturing key coastal positions and cutting off Antony's naval support. The strategy was simple and merciless: isolate, harass, and choke the enemy's will to fight. The land route back to Egypt was now blocked. The sea offered the only chance of escape. And so, with options fading and pressure mounting, Antony made his decision to break through the blockade and flee to Alexandria, where he could regroup. It was a gamble, a desperate one. On the morning of September 2nd, Antony's fleet emerged from the harbor in a long line, Cleopatra's ships at the rear. The Roman vessels under Octavian's command waited silently beyond the mouth of the Gulf. It was calm, still, as if the world itself had paused to watch. Antony's warships, many of them quinqueremes, towering broad vessels powered by banks of oarsmen, were built more for intimidation than agility. Their prows were reinforced for ramming, and they carried towers bristling with archers and artillery. But they were slow, cumbersome. And their crews, drawn from dwindling numbers and foreign lands, lacked the discipline of Roman marines. Octavian's ships, by contrast, were lighter and faster. Agrippa had drilled them to near perfection, and his men knew the sea like it was stitched into their bones. When battle was joined, it unfolded like a dance, brutal, rhythmic, chaotic. Ship slammed into ship. Grappling hooks flew. Fires broke out across wooden decks. Screams pierced the din as soldiers clashed with swords and axes, while catapults hurled stones from rocking hulls. The sea turned slick with pitch and blood. Agrippa's fleet swarmed the larger vessels, exploiting their sluggish turns, their blind spots. He ordered his ships not to board the enemy if it could be avoided. Instead, focus on outmaneuvering and disabling them. Precision over force. But the strangest part, and perhaps the most telling, came from the rear of Antony's line. For at the height of the battle, when the fighting raged hottest and confusion reigned, Cleopatra's squadron, her 60 or so Egyptian warships, slipped through the melee and made a dash southward, sails full and oars pumping hard for open water. Many claimed she had betrayed Antony. Others argued it was the plan all along, that she and Antony would escape together and rebuild in Egypt. But if that was the plan, something went terribly wrong. When Cleopatra fled, Antony saw her ship retreating through the smoke and chaos. In a moment that would echo down the centuries, he broke from the fight and followed. Abandoning his men, abandoning his command, he sailed after her, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because he had no choice. Either way, the sight of their commander fleeing shattered what remained of his fleet's morale. Some ships surrendered, others tried to follow and were sunk. The rest burned or were captured in the aftermath. Octavian had won. But more than that, he had ended something. The Republic, battered by internal strife for over a century, had finally collapsed under the weight of ambition, rivalry, and civil bloodshed. With Antony gone and Cleopatra retreating to Egypt, there was no one left who could challenge Octavian's claim. Over the following months, Octavian would pursue the remnants of their forces to Alexandria. Antony, surrounded and humiliated, took his own life, falling on his sword in a tragic imitation of Roman honor. Cleopatra would soon follow, famously allowing a venomous asp to bite her in her mausoleum, choosing death over parading through Roman chains. And so, by 30 BCE, Octavian stood alone, not just as victor of a war, but as master of a world. The Senate, weary and subservient, granted him extraordinary powers. They named him Augustus, a title dripping with divinity and reverence. Not king. No Roman would tolerate that, but something greater. Princeps, first citizen, father of the nation. In reality, he had become the first Roman emperor, and with his rule began a new chapter, the Pax Romana, a long, rare breath of peace in the ancient world, stretching across centuries. Roads were built, trade flourished. The arts, law, architecture, all blossomed under his reign. Rome expanded not only in territory, but in spirit. From a squabbling republic of patricians and plebeians, it had grown into an empire of marble, gold, and iron. But none of it, not a single stone, would have been laid if not for the salt and flame of Actium. For it was there, amid smoke-streaked sails and the screams of oarsmen, that the world shifted. Not with a thunderclap, but with a turning tide. The Republic had died at sea, and the Empire had risen from its foam. When the blood dried and the blades were sheathed, when the echoes of Actium faded, and the last of his rivals lay buried, Octavian didn't celebrate. He didn't climb to the highest steps of the Senate and declare himself emperor. He did something far more brilliant. He stepped back. In 27 BCE, with all of Rome watching, Octavian approached the Senate and offered to relinquish his extraordinary powers. He spoke humbly, as if reluctant to burden the state any longer. The Republic, he said, had been saved. His job was done. Let the Senate govern again as it had in the days of old. But the Senate, cowed, grateful, and perhaps terrified, refused. They begged him to stay on, to guide Rome through this fragile rebirth. And so, with a gesture of duty rather than ambition, Octavian accepted. The Senate granted him new honors: Augustus, the revered one; Princeps, the first citizen. He would be consul and tribune, censor, imperator, but not dictator, never dictator. That word still stung from Caesar's fate. It was a performance, a masterstroke of political theater. The Republic hadn't been restored. It had been embalmed, dressed in robes, and paraded through the streets like a living thing. But beneath the surface, it was dead. Power now flowed through one man. Quietly, unquestionably. And so began the reign of Augustus. He ruled for over 4 decades, not by fear or brute force, but through careful balance of illusion and control, tradition and transformation. What he built wasn't just an empire, it was a machine, and it would run long after he turned to dust. The first thing he did was fix the most dangerous problem of all: the legions. Rome's military had grown monstrous. During the civil wars, it was loyalty to generals, not to the Senate, that determined the fate of the Republic. Caesar, Pompey, Antony, each had marched with armies loyal only to them. Augustus knew this could never happen again. So he restructured everything. He reduced the number of legions, keeping a standing army of around 28, roughly 150,000 men, all salaried by the state, not personal fortune. A new military treasury was established, funded by special taxes. Soldiers would serve fixed terms, typically 20 years, and upon retirement, they were granted generous pensions, often in the form of land. He created a permanent military career path. Loyalty, order, discipline, those became the hallmarks of the new Roman army. No more roaming warlords. No more armies for hire. The famed Praetorian Guard was formed, an elite force stationed not on the frontiers, but in Rome itself. Their duty? To protect the emperor. And while they were Augustus's silent shield, they would, in later years, become kingmakers or king breakers. Next came the provinces. The empire was vast. From the windswept hills of Hispania to the deserts of Syria, chaos and corruption festered in the outer provinces. Governors appointed by the Senate often plundered their regions, exploiting the locals and enriching themselves. Augustus divided the empire into 2 kinds of provinces. The senatorial provinces, peaceful, stable, remained under nominal Senate control. But the imperial provinces, those near hostile frontiers or with large garrisons, were governed directly by Augustus through his legates. These weren't mere appointments. They were his eyes and hands abroad. He also introduced a more regular system of census-taking and taxation. Under his direction, administrators began to count people not just to boast of Rome's might, but to tax them fairly. A postal system was established, roads were extended, trade routes secured, grain flowed more freely into Rome. Famine, once a constant shadow, began to retreat. Rome's coffers filled. With financial stability came civic transformation. Augustus famously declared, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble." This wasn't empty rhetoric. Across the city, construction soared. He restored over 80 temples, each a statement, not just of piety, but of continuity with Rome's religious past. The Temple of Mars Ultor stood in his new forum, dedicated to the god of war who had avenged Caesar's murder. It wasn't just a temple. It was a monument to his legitimacy. The Arapaces, the altar of peace, was built to commemorate the Pax Romana, the peace his reign had brought. Its friezes didn't show gods or battles, but Augustus's own family in procession, noble, serene, eternal. The message was clear. Rome's future was safe because the house of Augustus was eternal. He built aqueducts. He paved roads. He established the Cura Annani, a grain distribution program to ensure the urban poor had access to food. A powerful tool for both compassion and control. And while stone reshaped the skyline, Augustus turned to something more delicate: the Roman soul. Art, literature, and culture thrived under his patronage. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, an epic linking Rome's origins to the hero Aeneas, son of Venus, and by extension, to Augustus himself. Horace penned odes to duty and virtue. Livy chronicled Rome's glorious past in his monumental Ab Urbe Condita. This wasn't coincidence. It was statecraft. Through myth, history, and poetry, Augustus rewrote Rome's story. He became not just a ruler, but the culmination of a divine destiny, a living link between past and future, a symbol of the ideal Roman. Yet for all his achievements, Augustus understood something critical. Appearances mattered more than absolutes. He never wore a crown. He dressed like any senator. He held public elections, even if the outcomes were already decided. The Senate still met. Laws were still passed. But all key decisions flowed from him. He was careful, calculated, almost invisible in his control. That's why he lasted where Caesar fell. Even his private life was curated. He promoted strict morality, exiling his own daughter Julia for promiscuity, even as scandal whispered through the palaces. He encouraged marriage and childbearing among the elite, offering tax incentives to large families. He wanted stability, legacy, heirs, not just for himself, but for Rome. And yet, succession remained his great dilemma. He had no son. He adopted several heirs over the years. First his nephew Marcellus, then Agrippa, then Agrippa's sons Gaius and Lucius. But fate stole them one by one. Illness, accidents, misfortune. Some whispered darker theories. In the end, it was Tiberius, his stepson, brooding and distant, who would inherit the empire. Augustus groomed him reluctantly, knowing he lacked charisma but not competence. When Augustus finally died in 14 CE, Rome did not erupt in chaos. There were no civil wars, no desperate scrambles for power. The machinery he built worked. Tiberius stepped in, cold, methodical, prepared. And the Republic did not return. In fact, it never would. The funeral of Augustus was a spectacle. His body was carried through the streets, mourned by citizens who had known only his rule. Senators delivered eulogies, priests offered sacrifices, and when his ashes were laid to rest in the mausoleum he had built for himself, the Senate declared him a god, Divus Augustus, from man to myth. And so the man who began as Octavian, the untested heir of a murdered dictator, had reshaped the known world. Without ever seizing a throne, he had built an empire. Without ever crowning himself king, he had become one in all but name. His legacy wasn't just in marble or laws, but in the very structure of imperial power, centralized, enduring, deceptively stable. Every emperor who followed, from madmen to philosophers, would walk in the shadow of Augustus. And for nearly 500 years in the West, and over 1,000 more in the East, his reforms echoed. Rome had changed forever. But the genius of Augustus was that no one noticed, not at first. He hadn't shattered the Republic. He had embalmed it, like a statue cast in bronze, perfect and unmoving. And while senators still spoke and elections still occurred, they were hollow rituals. The real power sat quietly behind the scenes, robed in tradition, veiled in modesty, and crowned with something far more enduring than gold: legacy. For 8 centuries, the walls of Rome had stood unbroken. Invaders had come close. Hannibal himself once camped within sight of the city, but even he, the scourge of Rome, never breached its gates. Earthquakes had shaken the soil. Civil wars had torn through its alleys. Emperors had risen and fallen, but the eternal city endured. And then, one dark night in August of the year 410, that illusion shattered. They came not from the east, but from the forests and highlands beyond the Danube, a people Rome had once called barbari, foreigners, outsiders. They were not a faceless horde, but a nation on the move. Families, warriors, elders, and children. A tribe displaced and hardened by decades of betrayal, exploitation, and broken promises. At their head rode Alaric, a Gothic king. Though not crowned in the Roman sense, he was born not into a palace, but into a storm. He had once served Rome, fought for it, studied it. He understood the empire better than many of its own rulers, but Alaric also knew that Rome was no longer the titan it had once been. The old gods had faded, the discipline of the legions had thinned, the emperors had grown weak, and the court bled gold while the people starved. So he gathered his people, the Visigoths, and began a campaign that would shake the foundations of the known world. But the story of Rome's fall doesn't begin with the sack. It begins with desperation. The Western Roman Empire, by the early 5th century, was a shadow of its former self. The emperors no longer commanded legions out of strength, but begged for loyalty through bribes. The economy staggered beneath the weight of inflation, corruption, and endless war. Barbarian tribes, Huns, Vandals, Franks, Goths, pressed on every border like wolves at the edge of firelight. And Rome. Rome was no longer the capital. That title had been moved to Mediolanum, Milan, and later to Ravenna, a city tucked behind marshes and walls, safer, more defensible. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The emperor had left the eternal city behind. Alaric had tried peace, again and again. He had marched his people into Roman territory not as invaders, but as refugees. They needed land, food, recognition, a place within the empire. But the Senate, proud and detached, refused. The generals sneered, and worse, they cheated the Goths. Rations were withheld, settlements delayed, treaties broken. Eventually, Alaric stopped asking. In 408 CE, he marched on Italy. His army moved like a slow storm, not out of recklessness, but strategy. He bypassed fortified cities, seized grain stores, and cut supply lines. Rome was isolated, starved, choked. Then came the first siege. The city's walls, built long ago during the height of the Republic, were still formidable, but the defenders inside were few. The legions had been pulled to other fronts, and those that remained were stretched thin. Within weeks, famine began to set in. Bread was rationed. The poor starved. Disease crept through the alleys like a curse. Rome, for the first time in centuries, begged. The Senate sent envoys to Alaric. They offered gold, silver, whatever tribute they could gather. He accepted, then demanded more. He was not merely after coin. He wanted dignity, negotiation, justice. The emperor at the time, Honorius, remained holed up in Ravenna, safe, paralyzed. He refused to meet Alaric's terms. He trusted instead in one man, Flavius Stilicho, a general of barbarian birth who had once held the empire together with sheer will. But Stilicho was dead, assassinated. Honorius, fearing Stilicho's influence, had ordered his execution. And with him, Rome's last great general was gone. Alaric resumed the siege, a second time and then a third. Finally, on the night of August 24th, 410, someone opened the gates. No one knows for sure who. Some say it was slaves, others claim it was sympathizers, perhaps even members of the Senate, desperate to avoid starvation. But when the gates swung wide, the Visigoths poured in. And for the first time since the Gauls sacked it in 390 BCE, the city of Rome, the heart of an empire, fell to an enemy's hands. But this was no mindless slaughter. Alaric had given strict orders. The churches were to be spared. His men were not to raise the city. This was not vengeance. It was a message. And yet sack is never clean. The line between discipline and chaos is thin when blood is spilled. 3 days they looted. They took gold from temples, jewelry from aristocrats, statues, silks, relics, all carted away by Gothic hands. The tombs of emperors were desecrated. The palace of the Caesars was ransacked. Fires broke out. Screams echoed across the hills. Some citizens were killed, but many were simply broken, watching their world unravel not with a bang but a groan. Women were taken. Nobles were dragged from their villas. Slaves disappeared into the tide. The city did not burn to the ground. It was not destroyed as Carthage once had been, but it had been violated, defiled. The illusion was shattered. Rome, the eternal city, had fallen. The world recoiled. In the distant corners of the empire, in Gaul, in Africa, in the eastern courts of Constantinople, the news struck like thunder. Letters were written in disbelief. Pagan philosophers mourned the death of the gods. Christian bishops, like St. Augustine, scrambled to answer the question, how could this happen to God's chosen city? He wrote his masterwork, The City of God, in response, arguing that no earthly city was truly eternal, only the heavenly one endured. But the shock could not be contained with scripture. To the Roman psyche, the fall of the city was more than military failure. It was cosmic rupture. For centuries, Rome had seen itself as invincible. It was Roma Eterna, the navel of the world. To see its streets overrun by outsiders, by those once labeled savages, was unthinkable. The psychological damage was irreversible. And yet, the Western Empire limped on. Emperors still ruled from Ravenna. Bureaucrats still collected taxes. Armies still marched, though less often in triumph. But the heart was gone. The myth was broken. Alaric didn't stay in Rome. He led his people south, hoping to reach Sicily and eventually North Africa. But fate, ever cruel, had other plans. He fell ill, suddenly, mysteriously, and died later that year. The Goths buried him with honor. According to legend, they diverted a river, buried Alaric beneath its bed with treasures and weapons, and then returned the waters to their course. The slaves who performed the burial were slaughtered, so the location would never be revealed. Whether true or not, the myth endures. Like Alaric himself, a shadow cast across the dying light of Rome. In the years that followed, the Western Empire would suffer blow after blow. The Vandals would sack Rome again in 455. Britain would be abandoned. Gaul would fall to the Franks. The Rhine would be lost forever. By 476, the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, would be deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer, and that would mark the end. But it began here, not with a final battle, not with a climactic war, but with a slow unraveling and the ghostly sound of hooves in the streets of Rome. The sack of 410 wasn't just an event, it was a crack in the foundation of a world order. A moment when the ancient world shifted, and a new darker age began to rise from the ruins. Rome, they said, could never fall. And yet it did, not all at once, but piece by piece. With every torch-lit alley, every toppled statue, every voice that cried out in the night as the gates opened and the Visigoths poured in. And though the stones of Rome still stood, something sacred had been taken, something that would never return. It did not end with a roar. There was no great climactic battle, no last stand on the steps of the Senate, no fiery collapse beneath a blood-red sky. The Western Roman Empire, once master of the known world, ended quietly in a palace, with the stroke of a pen and the shrug of a foreign general. The year was 476 EE. The boy who wore the imperial purple was named Romulus Augustulus. Little Augustus, they called him, a name that echoed greatness and yet carried none. He was only a teenager, a puppet placed on the throne not by lineage or merit, but by the ambitions of his father, a Roman general named Orestes. Orestes had once served under Attila the Hun, yes, that Attila, and had returned to Rome with fire in his belly. He saw a throne with no weight behind it and took it, forcing out the previous emperor and crowning his own son in his place. The boy would reign in name only, for less than a year. And when his time came to fall, no armies came to defend him. No eagles rose into the sky, no gods wept. His end was symbolic, and yet it marked a shift in the tide of history so vast that even the people living through it barely understood its weight. To understand how this boy came to represent the death of an empire, we have to look at what Rome had become. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was no longer a unified titan. It was a splintered, wheezing relic. The legions were no longer Roman, not in blood or spirit. Most were Germanic mercenaries, Franks, Goths, Vandals, fighting for coin, not country. The borders had long since fractured. Gaul was gone. Hispania lost. Britain had been abandoned decades before. Rome itself, a shadow. The emperors hadn't ruled from the city in generations. Milan had become the new capital, and then Ravenna, a swampy fortress surrounded by marshes, where the last remnants of the Roman court huddled in isolation, issuing decrees to lands they no longer controlled. The economy was broken. The silver had been shaved off the coins. Trade routes had collapsed. Roads crumbled. The great Roman bathhouses, once marvels of engineering and luxury, sat cold and empty. Grain shipments from Africa, once the lifeblood of the empire, now filled the granaries of the Vandals, who had taken Carthage. It wasn't just the land that was slipping away, it was the identity of Rome itself. Gone were the days of emperors like Trajan or Marcus Aurelius. Soldier scholars who strode across continents and built empires with pen and sword. In their place were weaklings, schemers, and shadows. Emperors rose and fell like autumn leaves, most ruling only a year or two before being assassinated, deposed, or quietly discarded. And into this vacuum stepped man like Odoacer. He was a Germanic warrior of the Siri tribe, a commander of barbarian troops serving in the Roman army. By 476, he had become the leader of the Foederati, the foreign mercenaries who formed the backbone of what remained of the Western military. They wanted land. Not gold, not titles, land. Payment for their years of service. But Orestes, the father of Romulus Augustulus, refused. That was a mistake. The mercenaries turned on him. Odoacer marched on Ravenna, the so-called capital of the West. Orestes was captured and executed. The boy emperor Romulus was spared, not out of mercy, but because he simply wasn't worth the trouble. Odoacer stripped him of his title and sent him away to live in obscurity, perhaps in a villa in Campania, living out his days in quiet exile, forgotten by history. Some say he lived well into adulthood, others claim he disappeared. No one truly knows. The empire that crowned him forgot him just as quickly. Odoacer didn't bother placing a new emperor on the Western throne. He did something different. He sent the imperial regalia, the crown, the purple cloak, the eagle-topped scepter, to the Eastern Roman emperor in Constantinople, a man named Zeno. And in doing so, he declared that one emperor was enough. Rome The true Rome, the eternal Rome, would now reside in the east. Zeno accepted the gesture, perhaps with a sigh of relief. He had his own problems after all. But officially, legally, and symbolically, the Western Roman Empire had come to an end. Just like that. It was the end of something ancient, something that had lasted, in one form or another, for over 1,000 years. From the days of Romulus and Remus, suckled by a she-wolf in myth, to the Republic's rise, through Caesar's ambition, Augustus's reforms, and Constantine's conversion, all the way to this final boy named Romulus, reduced to a footnote in a villa far from power. But here's the strange part. To most people alive at the time, life didn't change overnight. There was no single moment where a Roman citizen looked up and said, "Ah, yes." Now the empire has fallen. The institutions had already rotted. The cities had emptied. The barbarians were already in power, just wearing Roman clothes. The transformation had been slow, generations long. It was like watching a statue weather down into a pile of dust. And yet, the date 476 has endured. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was clear. It gave historians a line in the sand, a final breath, a convenient end to what we call antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. But the truth is more complicated. Because the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly 1,000 more years. Its emperors still called themselves Roman. Its citizens still spoke Latin and Greek. Its armies marched under the eagle. Its scholars preserved the ancient knowledge of the classical world. For them, the fall of the West was a tragedy, but not the end. And for the people of Italy, Odoacer ruled not as a barbarian overlord, but as a patrician. He kept Roman titles, honored Roman traditions, even minted coins with the face of the Eastern Emperor. But something had changed, something profound. Power no longer flowed from the Senate or the Caesars. It came from the sword, from chieftains and warlords, from tribes and clans, not the res publica. The Western world had entered a new phase, one of castles, not colosseums, of kings, not consuls, of monasteries, not marble forums. And while the memory of Rome would live on, whispered in churches, etched into law codes, painted onto medieval shields, the Rome that once united the Mediterranean under its banner was gone, dead, but not forgotten. Charlemagne, centuries later, would call himself Emperor of the Romans. The Holy Roman Empire would be born from this longing, trying to breathe life into a ghost. Renaissance scholars would dig through Roman ruins like priests deciphering sacred scripture. The name Caesar would echo in the titles of emperors long after, in the German Kaiser, the Russian Tsar, because Rome, even in death, was immortal. It was more than a city, more than a state. It was an idea that order could be forged from chaos, that roads could bind distant lands, that law could tame ambition, that a farmer from Hispania could become an emperor, that power could be civilized, at least for a time. But in 476 CE, that dream flickered. Not out of violence or fire, but out of exhaustion. 1,000 cuts, 1,000 failures, and 1,000 forgotten names led to the moment when a boy named Romulus handed back his crown, and a man named Odoacer began to rule in his own name. And so ended the Western Roman Empire, not with a fall, but with a surrender. And so we come to the end. Not just the end of this story, but the end of something much greater, the arc of the Roman Empire itself, from its first breath beneath the rising star of Augustus to its last quiet gasp in the fractured courts of forgotten emperors. What began as a republic of farmers and soldiers, stubborn men bound by law and pride, became the most enduring empire the Western world had ever seen. A realm of marble and steel, of philosophy and conquest, of law, language, and legacy. From the moment Augustus wrapped his fingers around the levers of power in 27 BCA, the Roman Empire entered a new phase, no longer a republic bound by senatorial checks and civic duty, but an autocracy masked in the robes of tradition. Augustus knew what Caesar had not, that empires are not won by force alone. They are sustained by structure, by illusion, by time. Under Augustus, Rome didn't simply survive, it flourished. Temples rose, roads stretched like veins across continents. Grain flowed from Egypt, gold from Hispania, silk from the east. Rome became not just a place, but an idea, an eternal city around which the world revolved. His successors would inherit the throne, some wisely, others with blood on their hands. The Julio, Claudians gave us Caligula and Nero, monsters in the shape of men. The Flavians gave us the Colosseum. The Antonines gave us peace, prosperity. And Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king whose meditations still echo through time. But power is never still. As Rome expanded, so too did its cracks. By the 3rd century, emperors rose and fell at the whim of armies. Barracks emperors, proclaimed by legions, reigned for months, sometimes only days, before being replaced, assassinated, or forgotten. Civil wars became as common as seasons. The frontiers grew brittle. The Danube swelled with pressure. The East stirred. It was a crisis of identity. A world too large, too diverse, too hungry to be governed by marble statues and Latin edicts. And yet, Rome endured. Then came Diocletian, reformer, organizer, tyrant. He split the empire in two, east and west, hoping bureaucracy might succeed where blood had failed. For a time, it worked. Order returned. Taxes were collected. Borders reinforced. But beneath the surface, change was coming. A new world, unfamiliar and unstoppable. The rise of Christianity reshaped Rome in ways no barbarian ever could. Born in obscurity, nurtured in catacombs, and once hunted by emperors, the Christian faith eventually became the empire's soul. With Constantine came the cross and the Edict of Milan. With Theodosius came the death of the old gods. Rome the pagan lion became Rome the Christian lamb. Temples were shuttered, altars overturned, the forum quieted. But faith alone could not halt decay. The West, battered by centuries of misrule, corruption, invasion, and economic collapse, began to fold. The Rhine was breached, Gaul slipped away, Britannia was abandoned. And then, the unthinkable. In 410 CE, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths. For the first time in 800 years, the walls had been breached. Not in myth, but in brutal, chaotic truth. From there, it was a long, slow fall. By the time the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus surrendered the throne in 476, the Western Empire was a ghost, its authority limited to a thin strip of Italy, its armies full of foreign mercenaries, its cities hollowed out by plague and famine. There were no last words, no grand final battle, just silence. But even in that silence, Rome lived on, because the empire had not truly died, it had transformed. In the east, in Constantinople, the city founded by Constantine himself, the Roman Empire endured for nearly another 1,000 years. Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, and bureaucratically Byzantine, it called itself Romania, the true Roman state. Its emperors still claimed descent from Augustus. Its laws preserved Roman tradition. Its armies held off the tides of Islam, Avar, Persian, Slav, and Turk. They would stand until 1453, when the walls of Constantinople finally crumbled beneath the cannons of the Ottomans. And with that, the last ember of Rome was extinguished. But even then, it wasn't truly over. Rome had become something more than empire, more than armies, aqueducts, and amp-hit heat-rees. It became the skeleton beneath Western civilization. Roman law would influence the legal codes of nations for centuries. Latin, the language of the Caesars, would evolve, reshaping itself into French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. The Roman Catholic Church would carry the titles of Caesar, Pontifex Maximus, Vicar of Christ, and rule from the Vatican, mere steps from where the Senate once debated the fate of kings. The very notion of empire, of centralized rule, roads, governors, currency, citizenship, these were Roman inventions passed down like heirlooms. Even the dream of Rome refused to die. Charlemagne would call himself Emperor of the Romans. So would the Tsars of Russia, Caesar in a new tongue. So would Napoleon and Mussolini and 1,000 others who looked at what Rome had been and wanted to bring it back. Because Rome had become eternal, not in stone, but in story. Not in power, but in memory. It taught us that civilization can rise from chaos and return to it. That order is fragile, that ambition can build wonders, and that pride can undo them. That peace is not the natural state of mankind, but a triumph of will and law and vision. It gave us poets and tyrants, philosophers and generals. It lit the world with marble and fire. It saw gods rise and kings fall, and people dream of something greater than tribe or tongue, something called citizenship, something called Rome. And now, centuries later, we still walk their roads, still speak their words, still write our laws in their ink, still read their stories, still marvel at their ruins, still wonder how it all could have ended. But perhaps that's the most Roman thing of all, to be remembered long after the banners fall. To echo through time, not as a single empire, but as an idea too vast to die. From Augustus to Augustulus, from triumph to ruin, from the Palatine to the pillars of Constantinople, Rome remains, not eternal in body, but in spirit, forever.